welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica, and I am here with the author of The Fabled Earth, Kimberly Brock. And this is like a really beautiful book. I learned so much from this book. I actually had no clue that the Cumberland Islands even existed. There was just a lot of really cool information and just really beautiful language and wonderful characters. So first of all, welcome, Kimberly.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So please chat a little bit with us about The Fabled Earth. And I know this is not your first book. You've written several before this. How this particular story came into being for you.
Okay, so yeah, this is my third novel. And once I start talking, you're going to know that I'm from North Georgia. So I write Southern fiction, and it's a little bit literary leaning, and it usually always has some sense of mysticism to it. Not necessarily like true magical realism, but the idea that things are possible. Things are possible that we may just not understand. I like mystery. So this novel, I guess it just was like, oh, let's write a book about all of my favorite things. So I wrote a story that has a lot of folklore because I'm from the foothills of Appalachia and I love Appalachian folklore. I love how stories travel across oceans, across families, across generations. And then I also love the Georgia coast. And I knew about Cumberland Island from the time I was really young. So I made a trip there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And when I saw it, I knew it was the setting that I wanted for this kind of story. And there are ghosts in this story, and there's a lot of history. I love the long history of the state of Georgia and the idea that it just rolls over and rolls over and rolls over generation after generation. And I like the connection that I can create with those metaphors, tides and rivers, but also that it connects back to the mountains of Appalachia and then across the ocean. So all of those things were coming together, and the idea of our ghost stories, our long and difficult history, some of it history that we don't like to talk about.
Yes, and that is a running theme in the story, both that and folklore. And there's so much just history in it. Now, first of all, the Carnegie family comes into play in the 1930s storyline. There are two dual timelines. So tell us a little bit about Cumberland Island itself and how that kind of became a focal point for it. Like, what's the history for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so there's the trick. See, the tell you a little bit about is like that is a total joke because when you start to research Cumberland Island, the history is long and vast. That is one of the reasons that I was compelled to write about it. And it is the kind of history that you would expect for early colonial America before colonies, indigenous populations that were there and removed. And then you'd stumble across this really strange, unexpected history because in the 1880s, one of the Carnegie brothers, so there's Andrew Carnegie that we mostly know as the famous Carnegie brother, who was the philanthropist and built all the libraries and gave all of his money away. Well, he had a brother, Tom. And since I'm writing a Southern story, of course, this is about his brother, Tommy. And Tommy and his wife came to Cumberland, and she loved it and wanted to build a summer home there. So there are these Gilded Age mansions on Cumberland Island, like they just dropped from the sky. onto this wild island. It is our southernmost island off the coast of Georgia, and it remains mostly undeveloped. Today, it is a national park, and you can only get there by boat, and there's only a certain amount of people that are allowed on the island. You can only travel on the island. There's park rangers, and some of the people who still live there and own property are the only ones who have vehicles. Everything else is by bike, or you can hike. You can stay there and camp. And then one of the homes that the Carnegie family built is now an inn, Grayfield Inn. But when they initially bought on Cumberland, they bought a house that was built during the Revolutionary years, and it was taken to the ground and they rebuilt on top of it. So it was called Dungeness. And then the Carnegies built a new Dungeness, a second Dungeness, and he died within a few years. And his wife continued to build that house. It was huge, this sprawling, beautiful, kind of creepy mansion, Victorian looking thing. And it was the home for her and her 9 children, one of their summer homes. And then over the years, as her kids grew up, she built homes for them on the island. So there were multiple mansions all over this island, and everything had to be brought in. So it was very expensive, and very expensive to keep these houses running. So when I wrote the book, I set it in the summer of 1932, when they had already abandoned that main house in the 20s. And it's sitting there spooky, and it was very Southern Gothic, and I just thought it was fantastic. So in 1959, the second timeline, and this is historically true, Dungeness Mansion was destroyed by a fire, and they called it arson, although no one was ever charged. And there are theories about what happened and why, because there was a lot of poaching going on and people toting shotguns and trying to, protect their property and trespassing between the Carnegie family and the people who were local. And I kind of made up my own little Southern Gothic story to do with that. I liked the Carnegies because this was, in a way, their home, and it remains that way. But also, it's a place that's so strange. It's almost like you're stepping outside of time, and there are no rules except the rules that they made on that island. So it gave me a nice backdrop for an interesting story. I thought if I wanted something mythical that I could write about and think about the themes I wanted to talk about with our folklore, our local folklore, the folklore we make out of our families and our communities, the heroes we make, whether they deserve to be heroes or not, that they were sort of a set of old gods out on that island to the people who lived maybe over on the mainland looking at that. So that's where Cumberland Island came into play, and a trip that I made out there. I was married in 1996, and we got married in the backyard in this tiny little wedding with 20 something people under a big oak tree. It was kind of private and quiet. And then a few months later, we heard about the wedding of JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette on Cumberland Island. And this secret wedding. And I always loved the Georgia coast. And so it was compelling to me to think about that. It was romantic. And then, a few years later, the tragic plane crash. And I was very obsessed with that for a while. I hadn't thought about it when we planned our 25th wedding anniversary, and we went to Cumberland and we stayed at the Grayfield Inn, and we pulled up alongside the island, and I could see all of those trees with the Spanish moss hanging, and it's very eerie. It's very quiet and beautiful. And I realized in that moment that it would have also been their 25th wedding anniversary. And all of the hair stood up on my head, and I thought, oh, well, if there was ever a place to write a ghost story. And so I did.
It was great, and it was haunting. And you have this whole idea of people kind of coming back and haunting their own past, which I like. So we have Cleo, who is from the 1932 timeline, and then Frances Flood, who comes back and is returning to her estranged mother's home. You also have Audrey, who's a newlywed and also newly widowed, which is tragic. I mean, just you do hear stories about that, and unfortunately, I can also tell you I know people who that has happened to.
Mhm.
So these women haunt the story as well, whether or not they're from the past or whether or not they're from the present. All of the characters kind of brought just some really interesting dimension and just different levels to the story. Did one of them sort of come first and the other fell in place, or were they all there when you started building the plot and the story?
I was actually thinking about Frances Flood for a while. The person, who needs answers, who does not know her mother's story, who does not know what connects her family to this place. And so, of course, the answer to that is Cleo Woodbine. And when Frances comes back or comes to Cumberland to meet Cleo, Cleo's been living there as a recluse for decades, since the summer of 1932, and an event that happened with her and several of these wealthy young men who'd come for the summer to play for a couple of weeks there on Cumberland, and they have a bonfire every summer where they tell stories, and it's kind of a competition. They want to see, who's going to tell the worst story, the best story, the story that wins the night. And Cleo and Francis's mother are sort of involved in a love triangle, and things go very badly that night. Two boys drown. Cleo knows what happened that night and has lived with that tragedy. And now Frances is coming back to find out, because her mother's never talked about it until she dies and tells Frances, "You have to go see this woman." And at that point, it became Cleo that took over in my mind, because I was looking at Cleo in the present and who she is and how she feels when she finds out that Frances' mother has died. And here's Frances at her door asking these questions, and she's having to reflect on the past. And then I was thinking about Cleo in the past and writing the chapters in 1932. And I wanted to present them like her personal fable, her own folklore, because she has become a folklore in the location where she lives. People that live on the island, and then the people that live in a little fictional town on the coast called Reverie, they all know who Cleo is, or think they know who Cleo is. And so their stories all kind of become this sort of mythical folklore of the region. And Frances is intrigued by that, but Cleo became the voice that I really was following, I think. And also, I felt a little like Cleo when I pulled up alongside that island and I looked at those houses and I thought, what in the world am I doing here? I could not even begin to identify with that wealth and that just grandeur of it. And it seemed so otherworldly to me, the island itself. And so I was able to identify with those things about her. And then Audrey, I wanted Frances to have a friend, somebody that she could connect to. Cleo's very hard to connect to, and the two of them are at the inn that Audrey is running. And Audrey is such a lonely girl. She's such a lonely character, and I think she was lonely even before her marriage and the accident that kills her young husband. And she doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know yet. And to give her a little bit of support, I think, having Frances there. Frances is very practical. Her feet are on the ground and she is there to do a thing. She is very focused. I thought it was a lot of fun. I give Audrey a camera, and I kind of think a lot about the generation before me. I'm in my 50s, and I think about my mom, and I think about my grandmother, and I think about how young they were when they got married. Just like they just stepped right out of high school and into a wedding dress. There was nothing in between. And how do you even know who you are? How do you even know what you want or who this person is that you've married who's just another kid? And so I was thinking about all those things with Audrey, and she brings with her this love of photography. She took pictures in high school. And when she develops um, some of the film that she's used, she creates an accidental double exposure. And it is a eerie photograph that shows one of the boys that drowned in 1932, and everybody in town thinks that it's a ghost. And whether they believe it or not, it becomes this sort of carnival type environment around it, and she gets caught up in something that she doesn't feel great about. So I liked all of those ways to twist those relationships around, and the ways that those women then would be compelled to know one another and know themselves through one another.
It was really nice, just this really great tapestry of just tragedy and mystery and myth. I wanted to also talk a little bit about, you did a really good job. There's a lot of side characters, and I subscribed to your newsletter, and you did something super fun. There's a character, Ambrose, who's called Rosie. You made a Rosie's Ghost Tour, like a program on your website where it's immersive, and it talks about the area, it talks about the French Acadians, and it was just a really cool little Easter egg you did for your readers. How much do you get immersed in the story when you're writing it?
Uh, well, terribly so, I guess. I mean, I like to write about real places, but maybe what I should say is I like to be inspired by real places because I like to be able to take bits and pieces. And part of what inspired the little fictional town of Reverie is a town called St. Mary's. And there is a ferry that will carry you to Cumberland from St. Mary's. And I liked, southern towns. We have ghost tours. That's our thing. And so I liked the idea of using some of the elements that were present in St. Mary's that are true historically for these ghost stories that would be part of their town, their legacy there, what they know, what they celebrate, who they make into their folklore. And so I have this character, Rosie Devane, and Rosie is very charismatic and he loves his town and he loves the history there, but he kind of, I mean, his name is Rosie. He looks at his town through some rosy lenses sometimes, and he wants everybody to be happy there, and he wants everybody to remember and to feel connected and to celebrate what it is, but also he wants it to be a better place. I think for him these ghosts sometimes are holding him back from making change where he would like to see change. So I have it seem harmless that they celebrate these ghosts and that they walk around in remembrance of them on these tours, and it's all very romantic. But there's a flip side to that too. And Rosie also runs a movie theater in town, and I grew up. We had a historic movie theater in the town that I grew up in, and I loved it. And my grandmother told me, I remember my very first visit to the Wink Theater. It had this beautiful, like a tower of lights on the front over the marquee that lit up. And we would drive through town sometimes just to see it, drive past it. And I loved it. It was just romantic. And she told me it was haunted, which I loved. We shared just a I don't know, we loved ghost stories, and it wasn't ever to scare me. It was kind of thrilling. I was little. I was like 3 or 4 years old. And she said, "Don't let the ghost get you." And I thought that was fantastic. And then she also told me that there was a tunnel from the theater to the building next door. And people weren't really sure why. Some people could remember playing in it and running through it when they were younger and their parents worked downtown. And apparently it connected to another theater at one point. So there's still kind of some unknown history about that tunnel there, but I liked that idea. And the other place that I loved so much in town growing up was our library. And so those things influenced how I was thinking about what Reverie would be like. These places that celebrate story and ghosts.
Wow. That was such a great answer. That was so funny because that was like even more than I was expecting. And it's true. You do as somebody who's a tourist and who's been a tourist, you go to places and I love taking ghost tours, and you get like part of the story,
Right.
right? You get part of the story. And even if it's a story of tragedy, it's like you get the most, I suppose, the most sanitized version of tragedy,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Right.
like you're just like, oh man, that's really, wow, that's
Exactly. You just
haunting.
got
But
it.
there's always something underneath it. And I
Yep.
think, the question is like, when people go home, are they really thinking about that? And I thought that was very interesting, especially like when you also like, I love that the folklore also revolves around, drowning boys and boys being taken, because like, Selkie lore and mermaid
Yep.
lore is very dark. And that's like another thing, like as somebody, I'm going to be 45 in a few weeks, and I like I was the generation Little Mermaid, and
Hmm.
even that story was really, really not as sweet and happy ended as, the Disney version.
Oh,
But mermaids, when you really just start sort of researching the lore, it's not romantic. It's not, like there's darkness in it. And you really kind of played into that, like there's more to this idealistic southern town than what tourists will see. And
what
having,
is
yeah,
presented? Yeah.
yes, exactly, because that's, obviously, like they want their town to be a nice place. You want your town to be a nice place. You want people to want to come. But there's the other types of ghosts, and maybe acknowledging them are important. And the story of, just having the story of drownings, and it really just sort of marries that romanticism and tragedy, which is, I suppose, sort of a theme of the entire book.
Yes, it is. So one of the reasons that I placed it where I did, I really liked the natural landscape of Cumberland for all of the reasons I mentioned before, but also that river has the spot where all the locals call it the dividings, and it's where the tide runs in both directions, like it will in a saltwater marsh. And I love that idea that I could place Cleo right there in that point where she's existing. And I think it's how stories operate too, not just humanity, but I'm trying to put this into words. The idea that we're flowing in all directions, that we exist in the past, in the present, and in the future all at once. That what makes us human is that we have the ability to reflect, and we should. And that we can also dream, we can look toward the future. All of this while we are living in the present, so that it informs our present. And I wanted that to be the theme that ran through the whole book for all three of these women. And I think it was really important to me that none of the characters, none of them are heroes. None of them are particularly wise. They are living in a moment where they will come up against a choice every day, something different. And they're not prepared for those choices. They're not thinking ahead that, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to make this social choice today or this personal choice today that's going to redirect my life, because I don't think we live that way every day. But when they do, what do? Sometimes they do the right thing, sometimes they fail. Sometimes they do the right thing out of cowardice. And I wanted to look at that and think about, where does the wisdom come from? Do we have the wisdom to know what's right and wrong in 1959 and 1932 before we're in the moment? Or do we only know it after? And if we only know it after and we don't reflect on it, then what does that do for the dream that we're supposed to be having for our future? What does it do for the moment that we're living in? Those are the things I wanted to think about in terms of these particular characters, this little microcosm of a fictional place that I had created, and then painted as a folklore.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. This book is gorgeous. And I am so happy that you came on to talk to us about it.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, readers, come and check out The Fabled Earth by Kimberly Brock. When will this be out in the world?
October 1st, and I will be on a massive book tour, so come see me.
Yes, please check it out at your local library, your favorite independent bookstore, or whatever, wherever you buy your books or read your book. Libraries do not dislike bookstores. I think we're best friends personally.
I think so too. I love a library.
And if you happen to be in a place where Kimberly is, go say hi to her because she's lovely.
Hun, say hi. I have a ghost story of my own I may be telling.
Ooh. All right. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.